When we think of slave revolts in ancient Rome, the Spartacus Rebellion is the one that most often comes to mind, a story immortalized by its drama and violence. But Spartacus wasn't the only one to challenge the overwhelming power of the Roman Empire. In the underbelly of a society built on oppression, other equally fierce and determined uprisings emerged, marking history with their strength and tragedy. Hidden in the shadows of imperial glory, these revolts reveal the tireless resistance of thousands of slaves who, at different times, rose up against their masters in search of freedom. In this video, we'll uncover the stories of these other great revolts, exploring their leaders, their battles, and the devastating impacts they left on the fabric of the Roman Empire. Get ready to discover a lesser-known side of history, where the desire for freedom ignited revolts that nearly changed the course of Rome forever. The Sicilian Revolt, the first great uprising. The First Servile War, also known as the Sicilian Revolt, was the first major slave uprising in Roman history, occurring between 135 and 132 BCE. At that time, Sicily was one of the main agricultural centers of the Roman Empire, where vast plantations were worked by a large number of slaves who endured brutal working conditions. This environment of extreme oppression created a growing climate of dissatisfaction among the slaves, setting the stage for the revolt. The uprising was led by Eunus, a Syrian slave who claimed to have magical and prophetic powers. He declared himself king under the name Antiochus and managed to inspire and lead an army of rebellious slaves. Eunus, with his charisma and promise of freedom, united thousands of slaves willing to fight against their masters. In no time, the movement spread across the island, capturing cities and directly challenging Roman authority. Rome's initial response was slow, underestimating the threat posed by the slaves. This allowed the rebels to achieve significant victories and consolidate control over parts of Sicily. However, as the revolt grew in strength and organization, Rome recognized the seriousness of the situation and mobilized a more robust military response. Roman legions were sent to crush the uprising, resulting in bloody battles and a prolonged siege. The conflict was marked by the fierce resistance of the slaves, who, despite being poorly armed, fought with determination against Roman forces. However, Rome's military superiority eventually prevailed. Eunus was captured after the final defeat of the rebels, and although he died in prison before being judged, his legacy of resistance endured. In retaliation, Rome crucified thousands of slaves, in a brutal demonstration of power and control. The Sicilian Revolt left a lasting impact on Roman history. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the slavery system and showed that, despite their oppression, slaves had the capacity to challenge the empire. This uprising not only disrupted order in Sicily, but also served as a precursor to future insurrections that would continue to haunt Rome in the decades to come. The Second Servile War, the return of slave fury. The Second Servile War, which took place between 104 and 100 BCE, was a continuation of the tensions that had built up after the First Servile War. Once again, Sicily was the epicenter of a major slave uprising, where living conditions had deteriorated even further. The revolt began after the Roman Senate promised freedom to slaves who had fought as allies of Rome in previous conflicts, but the delay in granting this freedom provoked outrage and rebellion among the slaves. Salvius, a Cilician slave, emerged as the leader of this new uprising, assuming the title of king and adopting the name Tryphon. Under his leadership, the slaves quickly organized, forming an army that challenged Roman control on the island. The rebellion attracted slaves from all parts of Sicily, resulting in a movement that was even larger and more organized than the previous one. The rebels managed to capture several cities and establish a significant power base. The revolt received additional reinforcement with the rise of Athenian, a Greek slave who became one of the main commanders of the rebel army. Together, Salvius and Athenian coordinated effective attacks against the Roman legions, achieving impressive victories and threatening the stability of the region. Rome was once again forced to recognize the gravity of the insurrection and mobilize substantial forces to confront it. Rome sent consul Manius Aquilius to lead the suppression of the revolt. After several failed campaigns, Aquilius managed to encircle the rebel forces in a series of decisive battles. The slaves' resistance, though fierce, was eventually broken by the tactical and numerical superiority of the Roman legions. Salvius, Athenian, and many other leaders were killed in combat, while the surviving slaves faced a terrible fate. The brutal repression that followed, with thousands of slaves being crucified or executed, had a lasting impact on Sicily and throughout the Roman Empire. The Second Servile War reinforced Rome's need to maintain strict control over its enslaved populations, but also made it clear that the system of slavery was a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. The scars of these revolts would continue to influence Roman politics and society for many years. The Vettius Rebellion, an overlooked uprising. Although less known than the major uprisings in Sicily, the Vettius Rebellion, which took place in 73 BCE, was a significant revolt that shed light on the resistance of slaves in other parts of the Roman Empire. Led by Vettius, a slave who had gained military experience while serving a Roman master, this rebellion erupted in the region of Etruria, in central Italy. The revolt was sparked by the harsh working conditions on agricultural estates, where slaves were exploited to the limits of their endurance. Vettius managed to organize a considerable group of slaves, using his military skills to train them and turn them into a fighting force. With swift and well-coordinated attacks, the rebels began plundering estates and villas, spreading terror among local landowners. Vettius's leadership made the rebellion a serious challenge for Roman authorities in the region, who initially struggled to contain the attacks. Despite early successes, the Vettius Rebellion faced growing difficulties as Rome directed more resources to suppress it. Roman legions, under the command of experienced generals, eventually encircled the rebels in a series of decisive battles. Vettius and his followers fought bravely but were gradually overwhelmed by the numerical and tactical superiority of Roman forces. The rebellion was crushed, and Vettius, captured, was publicly executed as an example of the fate reserved for slaves who rebelled. The Vettius Rebellion, although shorter-lived than other uprisings, had a significant impact on the region of Etruria. It demonstrated that social tensions were present throughout Italy, not just in the more distant provinces of the empire. The revolt also highlighted the ability of slaves to organize and challenge the established order, even in areas close to Rome's power center. This uprising, while not achieving the same notoriety as other revolts, contributed to the growing sense of insecurity among Roman elites. The Vettius Rebellion reinforced the perception that the Roman slave system, while vital to the empire's economy, was also a constant source of danger and instability, capable of triggering violent uprisings at any moment. The Claudio Rebellion, a specter of resistance. The Claudio Rebellion, which took place in the 1st century CE, is a striking example of how slave resistance continued to be a disruptive force within the Roman Empire, even after the major uprisings of previous centuries. Claudio, a slave of British origin, was brought to Rome after the conquest of Britannia and was forced to work under inhumane conditions. Motivated by a desire for revenge and freedom, Claudio led a rebellion that, though limited in scale, had a profound impact on Roman society. The revolt began on a rural estate outside Rome, where Claudio managed to convince other slaves to join him in his fight against their oppressors. The group of rebels attacked their masters, seized weapons, and fled into the surrounding forests. Claudio's skill in leading his forces with guerrilla tactics allowed the revolt to sustain itself longer than expected, causing a series of embarrassments for Roman authorities. Rome, however, was determined to end the rebellion swiftly, especially given its proximity to the capital. Roman forces, commanded by a local praetor, relentlessly pursued the rebels, forcing them to disperse. Claudio and his followers were eventually encircled and defeated after a series of ambushes and skirmishes in the woods. The repression was brutal, with captured rebels being executed publicly and as a warning to others. Although the Claudio Rebellion did not reach the scale of other uprisings, its impact was significant. The fact that a slave from a recently conquered land led an insurrection so close to the heart of Rome stirred fears among the Roman elite about the loyalty of foreign slaves. The revolt also served as a harsh reminder that, regardless of where slaves were recruited from, the desire for freedom was universal and always represented a latent threat to the empire. The memory of the Claudio Rebellion remained as an example of resistance, highlighting the persistence of the rebellious spirit among Roman slaves. Even in defeat, the rebels showed that the struggle for freedom was a powerful force that would continue to challenge the Roman status quo, creating a specter of resistance that would haunt the empire for generations. The end of peace. Revolts in Gaul and Hispania. As the Roman Empire expanded, new regions and peoples were incorporated, but this also meant the introduction of large enslaved populations from diverse origins. Two of the most affected areas were Gaul and Hispania, where slave revolts became a symptom of the growing unrest in the provinces. During the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, these areas saw a series of uprisings that challenged Roman authority and shook the supposed peace imposed by the empire. In Gaul, slaves, often captured in local wars or at the empire's borders, were forced to work in mines or large estates. The harsh working conditions, combined with the natural hostility of the conquered peoples toward their rulers, created fertile ground for rebellion. Small uprisings frequently erupted, and in some cases, slaves managed to ally with free locals who also resented Roman rule. These temporary alliances led to violent clashes that required the intervention of Roman legions to restore order. Meanwhile, in Hispania, the silver mines, where thousands of slaves worked under brutal conditions, were the epicenter of several revolts. The most notable example was the rebellion led by a slave named Luzu, who, during the reign of Trajan, managed to organize a massive escape of slaves from the mines. Refugees in the mountains, the rebels mounted an armed resistance that challenged Roman authorities for several years. Luzu became a legendary figure among the slaves and local populations who saw him as a symbol of resistance against Roman power. The revolts in Gaul and Hispania, although generally smaller and less organized than the major uprisings in Sicily, demonstrated that slave discontent was not confined to a single region of the empire. The frequency and persistence of these uprisings indicated an underlying tension that was never completely eradicated, even in the most pacified provinces. Rome, increasingly dependent on slavery to sustain its economy and territorial expansion, faced the dilemma of maintaining peace in regions where oppression generated constant resistance. These rebellions not only affected regional stability, but also had significant economic and political implications. The need to deploy legions to suppress the uprisings and the loss of productivity in the affected areas represented significant costs for the empire. Furthermore, these revolts contributed to the deterioration of relations between Romans and local populations, exacerbating anti-Roman sentiment that would ultimately weaken imperial control over these provinces. Social and economic consequences of the revolts. The slave revolts that shook the Roman Empire left deep marks not only militarily but also on the empire's social and economic structures. Each uprising exposed the intrinsic flaws of the system of slavery, forcing Rome to confront the consequences of its excessive dependence on this labor force. The repercussions were wide-ranging, affecting both slaves and free citizens, and changed how Roman society dealt with slavery. Economically, slave revolts often led to a temporary decline in agricultural and mineral production, especially in regions like Sicily and Hispania, where uprisings were more common. The destruction of property, the flight of slaves, and the need to allocate military resources to suppress the revolts increased costs for landowners and the Roman state. Additionally, the constant threat of new revolts forced many landowners to invest in stricter security measures, such as hiring armed guards and building fortresses, further raising operational costs. Socially, the revolts created an atmosphere of distrust and fear among the Roman upper classes. The elite, who depended on slaves to maintain their lifestyle and wealth, began to view slavery not only as an economic necessity but also as a constant threat to their security. This fear led to changes in legislation, with harsher laws being implemented to control enslaved populations and prevent future uprisings. However, these repressive measures often only exacerbated resentment among the slaves, creating a vicious cycle of violence and repression. The revolts also had a significant impact on the enslaved populations themselves. Although most uprisings were brutally suppressed, the memory of these revolts served as a symbol of resistance and hope for slaves who continued to live under Roman rule. Stories of leaders like Eunus, Salvius, and Luzu were told and retold, fueling the desire for freedom and the idea that oppression could be challenged. These stories also served as a constant reminder to Rome that control over slaves was fragile and always threatened by new revolts. Furthermore, slave revolts influenced long-term Roman politics. Over time, the Roman elite began to realize that excessive reliance on slavery was unsustainable and potentially disastrous. Although slavery was never abolished, there was a gradual increase in the use of free labor, especially in regions more vulnerable to uprisings. This slow process of change was not enough to eradicate slavery, but it showed that revolts had forced Rome to reconsider some aspects of its economy and society. The memory of rebellions, lessons of resistance. The major slave revolts in the Roman Empire weren't just isolated acts of rebellion. They left a lasting legacy that echoed through the centuries. Although Rome managed to brutally suppress each of these uprisings, the memories of those struggles endured, both among the slaves and their oppressors. These revolts became powerful symbols of resistance, remembered as acts of courage against an unforgiving system. For the slaves, stories of revolts like those led by Eunus, Salvius, Vettius, and Claudius became sources of inspiration and hope. Even though most of these uprisings ended in defeat, the very fact that thousands of slaves rose up to challenge their masters created a narrative of resistance that spread throughout the empire. Oral traditions among slave communities kept the memories of these rebellions alive, fueling the desire for freedom and the belief that, one day, oppression could be overthrown. On the other hand, for the Roman elite, these revolts served as a constant reminder of the fragility of their control. The ruling class, which relied on slave labor to maintain their wealth and power, found themselves facing the reality that fear and repression alone weren't enough to ensure stability. The fear of new uprisings shaped Roman policy, leading to increasingly harsh measures to prevent further rebellions. However, the brutality of these measures only intensified the tension between masters and slaves, perpetuating a cycle of mistrust and violence. The memory of these revolts also influenced how Rome was remembered by posterity. Ancient historians, both Roman and foreign, documented these events, often with a mix of admiration for the rebels' bravery and horror at the violence that followed. These narratives helped shape the perception of the Roman Empire as a formidable power, but also as a society built on exploitation and injustice. Over time, these stories of resistance came to symbolize the universal struggle for freedom, resonating far beyond the Roman context. In the modern era, Roman slave revolts are often studied as examples of the power of collective resistance and the indomitable human spirit. They serve as a reminder that, even in the most difficult circumstances, there will always be those who rise up to fight against tyranny. The memory of these revolts continues to inspire movements for liberation and social justice around the world, highlighting the importance of remembering and learning from the past. Thus, the slave revolts in Roman history have left lessons that transcend time and place. They show us that the struggle for freedom is a powerful force that can challenge even the mightiest empires, and that resistance, even when seemingly defeated, can leave a legacy of hope and inspiration for future generations.